jetzt begrüßen Sie mit mir Dr. Michael Shermer.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and having me here. This is my European book tour for the Moral Arc. We were just in Cologne, and I'll apologize. We're out of the copies of the book already. We have a few copies left of my previous book, The Believing Brain, but we'll have more tomorrow in Tilburg. Sorry, they just shipped them here and there. And anyway, but there's always Amazon and Skeptic.com, of course. So my book title, of course, was inspired by the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speech at the end of his march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, marching for civil rights, primarily the right to vote. Legally, the right to vote had been there for 3/4 of a century, but it was not enforced. They were still not allowed to vote. And if you've seen the movie, or if you're going to see the film Selma, it's a dramatization of the event, of the marches. But two things. First of all, we just had the 50th anniversary last weekend, but that's not when it happened. It took them 3 times to get there. The third time, President Johnson armed federal troops and sent them down there to make sure that they got there safely, because otherwise they would have been blocked. And second, in the film, the actor who plays Dr. King doesn't give this famous speech where he asks, how long do we have to go? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. He gives a different speech because they couldn't get the rights to the actual speech from the King family. So they made up a speech. So I will show you the actual speech, just the opening minute of this, so you get the full drama of it.
I know you're asking today, how long will it take? Somebody's asking, how long will prejudice blind the visions of men? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth pressures will rise again. How long? Not long. Because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long. Because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. If that scaffold sways the future, behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long?
In fact, that was March of 1965, and just several months later, in August of that same year, President Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act that would allow all adults to vote, and Dr. King was there looking on. So sometimes the moral arc bends very quickly, sometimes not so quickly. Here's a graph tracking over the last several centuries the growth of democracies. That is, how many countries in the world, out of the 196 countries, how many are liberal democracies? Well, in 1800 there were 0. That is, countries where all adults can vote. That is clearly not the case until you get all the way up into really the early 1900s, when there's a burst of democracies after the First World War, and then a dip in the 30s, and then a burst after the Second World War, and then another huge burst in the 70s and 80s. We now have 118 liberal democracies. Democracies that score 8 or higher on the polity scale. The polity scale is a group of, sort of a collective group of scholars who rank democracies on a 1 to 10 scale. How transparent are the elections? How fair are the elections? To what extent can money corrupt the election, if you can imagine such a thing? And of course, that in addition to blacks, the right for women to vote. One of the heroes of my story is this woman named Inez Milholland. She's one of the early suffragettes who led a march on Washington, D.C., all the way up to the steps of the Capitol and the White House, mounted on this white stallion. Can you imagine being one of the cops out there to try to block this magnificent beast coming down on you, and following that all the way to the White House, that would be great. Often that's what it takes. It takes someone like her, it takes someone like Dr. King to lead the charge, but it's more than that. It takes a lot more than that to bring about a rights revolution. In fact, the moral rights revolution for women to vote happened sporadically around the world. First started in the first place was Pitcairn Island. You know Pitcairn Island? This is where the Bounty mutineers ended up. It's a tiny little rock in the middle of nowhere. I think there were 13 people on the island, 7 of them were women, and they said, we're going to vote. So sometimes it just takes that kind of majority. United Kingdom here in 1917, United States in 1920, and all the way up France, Mexico, Colombia. Switzerland, very late in the game, 1971. In fact, most women were not voting until 1990, based on how the cantons prevented, sort of like what happened in the South in the United States. It was legal, but still they prevented it from happening. The last country on earth should be Saudi Arabia this year. I put a question mark because maybe not. Although I did see that the Vatican City said never. Of course, the problem is they don't have any women. And that's not just a problem for voting. That's a subject for a different... Speaking of which, we are in the middle of another rights revolution right now, gay rights and same-sex marriage. It's a nice opportunity for us to study in real time as these debates unfold. You can see who supports it, who objects to it. In America, the transition happened right here between those who oppose it and those who support it crossed in 2011. You can see it here in the words of our own President Obama. He said, in 2008, I believe marriage is between a man and a woman. I am not in favor of gay marriage. And then 4 years later, after he won his second election, and then he said, I've just concluded for me personally, it's important for me to go ahead and affirm that I think same-sex couples should be able to get married. Now, to be fair, in 2008, he said that on the campaign trail. So you never know what politicians say to get elected. I think he probably always believed. I realize in countries like Germany, same-sex marriage is not a big deal. But you should come to America, where it still is somewhat controversial. These are a married couple friend of my wife who's from Cologne, and they're from Cologne. And, it's just not a big thing here. And that's where we will get in a few years in America. Within 5 to 10 years, I'm predicting, based on the fact that in June, the United States Supreme Court is going to vote on a particular case in which a state overturned its own constitution and said it's okay for gays to marry. And then the governor blocked it and said, no, it's not okay. So on challenges, it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they will vote. They're very likely to vote in favor of same-sex marriage, and that'll put an end to it once the Supreme Court votes on it. And then social attitudes will follow in 5 to 10 years. It'll be just like interracial marriage was half a century ago. Remember interracial marriage? No, of course you don't. I don't either. Blacks and whites should not get married. Are you serious? What? Who cares? Well, a lot of people cared back then. Now nobody cares. It'll be the same thing with same-sex marriage, gay rights. It'll be, in 5 to 10 years, everybody will be behind it. But now, that is not the case. It's primarily led by the millennials, people born in 1981 or after. They're the most supportive of same-sex marriage. Dragging behind are Generation X, us baby boomers, and slowly grinding along at the bottom are the silent generation, people born between 1928 and 1945. But not to worry, they won't be with us that much longer. Sometimes that's also what it takes. And who opposes it the most? Not only the older people, but also religious people. Those most opposed are white evangelicals, black Protestants, white mainline Protestants, and Catholics. Those most supportive are the religiously unaffiliated, the nones. The people that tick the box for none when you're asked, what religious affiliation are you? None. That's 1 out of 5 in America. 20% are nuns. And that's of everybody. In the millennials, born 1981 or after, it's a third. It's 33%. It's the fastest growing religious group in America, if you can call them that, because they're not religious. So they're the most supportive of it. And so I'm predicting that by 2020 to 2025, everybody will be in favor of it, including all religious people who will say things like, Jesus loves everybody, including gays. We were always in favor of same-sex marriage. You know that Episcopalian? Yeah, that was our guy. All right, well, just remember the data. how long it takes to bring them. By the way, I have some good news if you are in favor of both same-sex marriage and the legalization of pot. I found some biblical support for both. Yes, for both. You can quote this to your friends if you like. This is in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13. You remember this verse where it says, if a man lies with another man, he must be stoned. Thank you. Other rights revolutions that have unfolded over the centuries is the abolishment of torture. Torture was practiced quite commonly in most European countries. Now it's, the rights were invented in the late 18th century. Right around here is when the whole rights revolution first took off. And that's when you see the abolition of judicial torture. Because one of the rights is that people should not experience cruel and unusual punishment. What do I mean by cruel and unusual punishment? Well, how about breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, sawing somebody in half, upside down, it's extra fun that way, I guess, penetrating them through both orifices with a gigantic spear, or clawing and ripping their skin off with these instruments. Another fun device that people used was this iron bowl. So they put the accused inside this thing and closed this door and then lit a fire underneath. And as he cooked to death, he screams. And his screams come bellowing out of the mouth of the bull like it's alive. And it's just hilarious. People had the best time at these events. Or the rack. The wrists go up here, the ankles go down here, and you just stretch them apart till their limbs pop out. Here's a version of the rack at the Amsterdam Torture Museum, which we went to last week. So I took these rather dark pictures. But here they have nails on the rack for extra torture is fun. This is called the pear. It goes inside your mouth. It's for heretics that say bad things. It goes inside your mouth, and you crank that thing around, and it spreads it apart and rips your mouth apart, breaks your teeth, and so on for speaking bad words. But just for having bad thoughts, this is called the skull cracker. So you just strap somebody down here and you crank this thing around until their skull breaks open. This nice little chair here is also full with nails. And so you strap them in there and you crank it down and it pushes the chest back into the back where the nails are located. And then, of course, this is how you treat witches and heretics. You break their back on this device here, stretch them apart there, and then pour water in their mouth. Water all over their face and mouth. What does that sound like? Oh yeah, waterboarding. Now, of course, we don't practice torture in America anymore. No, we have enhanced interrogation. This is Orwellian speak for what is illegal, which is why we use different words to describe this. All this came mostly to an end in this first rights revolution. Outside of the Amsterdam Torture Museum, by the way, is this statue, which I found very appropriate. It's when you exit, it's there. Because that is what ended it, was Justitia, the goddess of justice. She has in her hands here a scale for a balanced trial. She's blindfolded, so she's not biased against the accused. And then she has a sword for enforcing the law, however the courts decide. That idea was invented in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment philosophers Jeremy Bentham and Cesare Beccaria, particularly the latter, in 1776 wrote a best-selling book called An Essay on Crimes and Punishments, in which he first articulated the principle of proportionality. There ought to be a fixed proportion between crimes and punishments. This is where the phrase that punishment should fit the crime comes into use. So instead of moralizing about bad behavior and then punishing somebody, torturing them, making them suffer for as long as possible for doing this bad behavior, which is a very religious, archaic, barbaric way of dealing with criminals and crime, they undertook the idea, let's treat it as a problem to be solved. How can we reduce the rates of crime in a society to make everybody better off? That, I claim, is what's been going on for the last 3 centuries, and I'll keep coming back to that point. Related to torture, of course, the whole point of torture is not to kill somebody initially, but to make them suffer for as long as possible before you kill them. And so related to that, of course, is the decline of the death penalty. It's already dead here in Europe. In the United States, it's almost dead. Here are some of the more creative ways that people use to employ capital punishment. This is the earliest known depiction of a capital punishment from an anthropologist who studies archaeological sites and hunter-gatherers. These are 10 archers here with their 10 bows, and there's a guy lying on the ground with 10 arrows in him. And so Christopher Boehm, who I got this from, anthropologist at USC, describes the way hunter-gatherer groups employ different techniques they employ to control the behavior of bad people. Psychopaths, bullies, nasty people, people that don't play nice by the rules. You shun them, you gossip about them, you tell them that's bad, don't do that again. You physically try to stop them, you constrain them, you expel them from the group, maybe they keep coming back. And if worse comes to worse, you just take the guy out for a hunt on the weekend, and you come back, and he's nowhere to be found. They just execute them. Well, we can hopefully do better than that. And so the idea behind the guillotine, for example, is that it obviates the torture part. It's just execute them as quickly as possible so that they don't suffer. If that's your goal, then it should be done as humanely as possible. Now, there was some debate to what extent that the brain keeps operating for a few seconds after it gets lopped off and it's bounding around in the basket there. No one's ever answered the question, obviously, but maybe a couple seconds, who knows. But it doesn't last long. Old Sparky was the electric chair was supposed to be an improvement on this, but too many people's heads caught on fire, and they writhed around. It took too long. So the firing squad was another option, and now we use lethal injection. But I just heard a news report that European pharmaceutical companies are refusing to sell phenobarbital and the other drugs to American states that still practice the death penalty. And so even in America, it's likely to go extinct by about 2025, the rate we're going. There's only 3 states that really practice it very much anymore: Texas, Ohio, and Florida. If you take them out, almost nobody's executed. My state of California, where I'm from, the last person executed was over 2 decades ago. Most of them just die of old age. I really don't understand why they botch these lethal injections. It's super simple. It's like I've had dogs my whole life. You take them to the vet when they're super old and they're suffering, and the vet, it's a very just gentle thing. You give them an injection, they fall asleep. Second injection stops the heart. It takes about 3 or 4 minutes. That's the end of the story. Just take those guys to the vet. I don't know what the problem is with these lethal injection things at jails. They keep screwing it up. At any rate, it's all going to come to an end shortly anyway. The abolition of slavery came about over the course of about a century. In the earliest parts of the 1700s, there were Quakers and Mennonites agitating for the abolition of slavery, but it really didn't come about until the Rights Revolution, until we shifted from religious arguments to secular arguments, arguments based on reason, arguments based on natural rights, that nobody has a right to be treated this way. And then you see the burst of it coming. This is the number of countries that abolished slavery as a legal institution. Again, late 18th century, early 19th century. In the United States, in England it happened in 1807, and then the British Navy had to patrol the coast of Africa for about half a century to enforce the law. So there's the passing of the law, then there's the enforcing of it. First there's winning the intellectual battle. Why is it wrong? You have to convince people that it's wrong. And then you have to pass the laws, then you have to enforce the laws, and all that can sometimes take a century. Now it takes a few decades or a few years. In the United States, it took a war and 660,000 dead to finally make it happen. And now we're in the middle of another rights revolution, animal rights. I have a whole chapter on animal rights. Which really began with, again, Jeremy Bentham, another Enlightenment philosopher, the father of utilitarianism, who said the question is not can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? So morality, the rational way to think about morality is to begin with the basics of can a sentient being suffer? Are they aware who they are and how they feel, and are they suffering? So that's where we begin. And we've come a long ways in those last 2 centuries. How far has the moral arc bent? I claim that everyone today, conservatives included, are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. Well, of course, you wouldn't have seen signs like this, but I grew up with these sorts of things. No dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans, restrooms for whites and coloreds, colored seated in the rear, we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. You don't see these sorts of things anymore at all. Everything has changed. Television shows, novels, comic books, all pop culture, all high culture, and so forth has changed. Continuing on, the decline of homicide. If you go to Copenhagen Natural History Museum there, they have archaeological findings. Here's just 2 pictures I took there. There's a guy with an arrow through his skull, and for good measure, a dagger through his sternum here in his chest. And this fellow who had his skull bashed in, and for good measure, an arrow point through his chest. If you look at the statistics that we have, going back first to hunter-gatherers and then to today, rates of homicides, that is, dying violently, were quite high. In the 1200s and 1300s, it was close to 100 per 100,000, which is how criminologists measure rates of homicide. In hunter-gatherer groups, it's about 10 times higher than that. It could be upwards of 1,000 per 100,000. And in some cases, it can be, that doesn't even work, just say 15 to 25% of all young males die violently in these kinds of groups. And so this debunks the myth of the noble savage, that before civilization, people lived in peaceful harmony. According to the people that study these things, these archaeological sites are filled with those kinds of skulls. What about war? Surely war hasn't gotten better. Surely war has gotten worse. And people usually cite the 20th century as the worst. And of course, World War I and World War II were catastrophic. 300 per 100,000. So 3 times worse than the worst it was ever in the most violent era of European history. And yet, the 20th century is 100 years long. It's not 50 years long. So something dramatic has happened. This was not atypical for the last 500 years of European history. This is atypical. The last 50 years, well, now 60 years, going on 70 years, something has happened. And so my next slide will just look at that little spike in that. So we go from 300 per 100,000 down to the 20s per 100,000, down to the teens per 100,000, single digits per 100,000, and less than 1 per 100,000 in terms of battle deaths. So even war has gotten less violent. People, even liberals, supporters of Obama, have been super critical of his use of drones. Mechanized death. There's some guy in Ohio and Arizona with a little, video game board watching these drones 10,000 miles away killing people. How barbaric is that? Not very, really, compared to carpet bombing where you killed 900,000 people to, get your target. Something like that. Here you may have 1 or 2 or a handful of collateral damage, so-called collateral damage, but you get the person you're after. It's all bad, but it's better war than the sort of carpet bombing kind of war. So drones are actually, believe it or not, a moral improvement on conducting war. Even nuclear weapons have declined. Here I have a graph from the book in which I tracked the peak of the Cold War in 1986. There were about 70,000 active nuclear weapons in the world ready to go. Now we're down to below 20,000, and actually between Russia and the United States, the 2 biggest holders, we each have about 4,000 to 5,000, so probably a little bit less than 10,000 active nuclear weapons. Still bad. You could still get catastrophic environmental changes if there was a nuclear exchange, but we're on the way down. Is nuclear zero possible? There's a lot of people that think it is. And I'm one of them. I think we can get to 0 maybe by 2050 or so. The biggest obstacle is not technological. We know how to disarm nuclear weapons and get rid of the material and so on. The biggest problem is psychological. It's called the other guy problem. I would get rid of my nukes, but this guy, I don't trust this guy. Let's call him, I don't know, Putin. So if he'll do it, then I'll do it. Then of course he's doing the same calculation that I'm doing, and so you have a trust problem. So it's trust but verify, and that's what's been getting us down here so far. Is that sort of treating it as a problem to be solved rather than moralizing about it, and leaders like Khrushchev and Kennedy acting like behavioral gain strategists rather than dictators to try to solve this particular problem. What about terrorism? Surely that's an existential threat. That's what everybody calls it. In fact, it's not. No terrorist group has ever taken over a state, displaced a government, started a new institution of governments, a constitution, things like that. In fact, the political scientist Erica Chenoweth has a newly published data set from last year. She has a book out in which she reports all this data. Now, basically, she tracked every single campaign for political change over the last 3/4 of a century and found that nonviolent campaigns were twice as successful as violent campaigns and twice as partially successful as violent campaigns. And violent campaigns are 4 times more likely to fail than nonviolent campaigns. And so the trend is toward nonviolence. If you want to get social change, nonviolence is a better way to go than violence, which is what Dr. King, his whole campaign was about, which he was inspired by Gandhi. What about these guys? With the barbaric beheading of people or burning them to death. Well, of course, ISIS is not a state. The word state is in their name, but they're not a state, and they never will be. In any case, this is just a process that we've already gone through in the Western world. Remember in the 13th century when Christians were beheading people? Here's a illustration from a 12th century illuminated French Bible. It shows 2 Christians with their swords about to behead 2 Jews with Jesus looking on approvingly. The crime that they committed, by the way, was they killed Jesus. What? I mean, these guys didn't kill Jesus. Well, the Jews killed Jesus. What? Jesus was Jewish. What are you talking about? And in any case, if Jesus had to die to save you for your sins, remember John 3:16, for God so loved the world he gave his only begotten Son so that you can have everlasting life because you were born with original sin in the Garden of Eden, blah, 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 blah. You accept Jesus as your Savior, you're in the club. He had to die. Shouldn't we be thanking the Jews for doing this? Because that's what had to happen, because God said, what? Okay, this is just an idiotic idea, is really what it is. And that's what leads to this kind of violence. Or burning people alive. That's cruel and barbaric. Yeah, but Christians used to do it fairly regularly. This is a woman about to be burned for heresy, but they did it for witchcraft as well. And I call that the witch theory of causality. That is, if you believe that women cavorting with demons in the middle of the night causes crop failures and diseases and the plague and bad weather, then you're either insane or you lived 500 years ago when everybody believed that. So the first step we have to take is debunk these crazy ideas. That's the first step. It's demonstrably true that women can't fly on brooms, demons don't really exist, therefore there's no such thing as witchcraft. You can just drop all that belief because it's not true. Here's a few other incorrect beliefs about people. That, for example, Jews poison wells or cause the Black Death. Or they wrote the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which was a Russian hoax at the start of the 20th century about how they were going to take over the world. Or that the Jews are backstabbers that caused a German defeat in World War I. Or that blacks are racially inferior. Or that women are weak-willed and too emotional to participate in the political process or to run corporations or, be the chancellor of a major nation. Or the gays want to spread the gay lifestyle, and the Christians, they just want to pray the gay away. Or that atheists are immoral and communists, or that animals feel no pain and do not suffer. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is debunk nonsense. That's the first step to expanding the moral sphere, to bending the moral arc, to making society a more moral place. So in that sense, let's ask the question, are these people that lived back then, we have to ask, what were they thinking? Were they immoral, or were they just mistaken? So I think the generous thing we should think about is that they were just mistaken. That is, correcting mistaken beliefs about people is the first step toward expanding the moral sphere. Now the problem, as my friend Steven Pinker points out in his magnificent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is that we have strong moral emotions that lead to too much moralizing. So the moment you hold an incorrect belief about another group of people, then your moral emotions kick in. Well, we have to do something about that because that's a problem for us. And that's when the moral emotions kick in. So I have a whole chapter on moral emotions in my book. I mean, emotions evolved to direct organisms to behave in a certain way. Hunger is an emotion to get you to eat, just to get you to be more active and start looking around for food, and so forth. And we have a whole host of emotions. For example, love, affection, and caring lead us to help other people. Anger leads us to strike out and fight back and defend ourselves against predators, bullies, and abusers. Fear causes us to pull back, retreat, and escape from risks. Disgust directs us to push out, eject, and expel that which is bad for us, such as bodily excreta and other disease vectors. And jealousy leads us to mate guarding. So you can kind of see how genocides happen. First, you hold incorrect beliefs about another group. Then you see them as a threat. You know, we have fear. We're fearful of them because they're going to hurt us. And then you start thinking of them as like a disease vector, like, oh, they're disgusting people. And genocides, if you look at the history of genocides, everybody who's committed them, almost to a cliche, comes up with the same metaphors. They're vermin, they're disease, they're insects, they're monkeys, they're, whatever the particular thing that triggers disgust in your culture, you can guarantee that the people committing the genocide will be using that metaphor. So this dual moral emotion that we have, that we evolved this capacity for within-group enmity. We're friendly to our fellow in-group members for the most part. And then evil. There's sort of between-group enmity. We're very suspicious of those who are different from us. So we're a little bit of Oskar Schindler and Amon Girth in each of us. The problem with Manichaean-type stories, there's a good guy and a bad guy, is that there's really no such thing as just good guys and bad guys in terms of understanding how the world works. All of us have the capacity for doing these kinds of things, which is sort of the point of Schindler's List, that Schindler wasn't an especially moral guy. He was something of an opportunist, but when the opportunity came, he actually did the right thing, and this guy, Amon Girth, did not. So these dual moral emotions for moralizing about people related to fairness and justice leads to conflicting motives. We help people, we hurt people. We're cooperative and we're competitive. We're all altruistic and we're greedy. We have better angels and inner demons. So I'm going to show you a short video clip here. It's only about 20 seconds long. I found this video clip one day when I was watching cat videos, and I came across this. I don't know where it is. I think it's here in Europe somewhere. And so you'll see these three people talking for just a second, and all of a sudden this guy reaches out and shoves this woman backwards. She sort of staggers back, and this guy reaches to grab her, and he misses. And into the pit she goes. So he starts to, like he's going to reach in and grab her, and then all of a sudden, you can just see this sort of urge bubble up, and he turns around, and he just cold cocks this guy. I mean, it's just a beautiful roundhouse, like right out of a Hollywood movie. Bam! Snaps this guy's neck back. And then, for good measure, bam! A second one. And this guy just staggers back against the wall here. And then this guy, he sort of staggers around for a second, like, okay, there was something else I was supposed to do. Oh yeah, my friend's in the pit. So he runs over and he pulls her out. Meanwhile, this guy takes off out the door, and he says something to her like, "Are you okay?" And she probably says, "Yeah." And then he just takes off after him, like, "I gotta get this bastard." And then meanwhile, while you're watching that, watch this guy. So he sees what happens. He's like an EMT emergency guy or something, and he comes running down the platform. And now she's in the pit, so you'd think he'd run in there to help this guy pull her out. Oh no. Off he goes to chase after this guy. Oops. Okay, here we go. Oh yeah, well, oh yeah, that's right. And there he goes after him. Go get the guy. So you can see that sort of dual, gotta get this guy, I got my friend, gotta get this guy. Dual, so we have multiple moral emotions here. And that sense of fairness and justice, I claim it's an evolved propensity. So I have a whole section in the book on, the sense of fairness and justice in animals, primates, in babies, teenagers, all the way up to adults and so forth. I'll show you this video clip from the great primatologist Franz de Waal. These little capuchin monkeys. Now, these are evolutionarily quite distant from us. Chimps are about 6 million years distance from us. Capuchins are like 15 to 20 million years. They're a long ways from us, and they still have a sense of right and wrong. And they have tiny little brains. I mean, brains even smaller than American politicians. And so this experimenter here has trained them to exchange a pebble for a piece of food. It's just classical conditioning. That doesn't take long to do it at all. So she gives him a rock. He gives it back to her. She rewards him with a piece of cucumber, and they like cucumbers. And then she does the same thing with him, but instead of giving him a slice of cucumber, she has over here a little bucket of grapes, so she gives him a grape. And they like the grapes better than the cucumbers because, you know, who doesn't? And so then this one sees that, and he's very excited, like, okay, oh boy, I'm going to get a grape. And so he swaps a rock, and she hands him a cucumber, and you'll see what he thinks about that.
So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again a cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
So of course they can't say, you know, I'm pissed. That's really not fair. But they can say it through their body language and communicate. And this is the point of these kinds of moral emotions, is to communicate to the other group members, that wasn't cool, I am unhappy about that, you better not do that again, I'm going to kick your ass. And maybe that changes their behavior, like, okay, all right, I'll be fair next time, right? It keeps the group in balance, so that it's fairly close to balance there. To show you that you all have these kinds of moral emotions, I'm going to give you a little thought experiment here, and you can answer this question with a show of hands. How many of you have ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? Come on, be honest now. This question was asked by David Buss, the great evolutionary psychologist, reported in his book, The Murderer Next Door, Why the Mind is Designed to Kill. As you might expect, no surprise, men were about twice as often as women to frequently think about killing somebody, but women caught up on the occasionally thinking about killing somebody. David was wise enough to ask his subjects, well, what would you actually do? What's in your fantasy? And they wrote him these long essays about what they thought about doing. One guy said he went 80% of the way toward killing a former friend and now a jealous rival. First, I would break every bone in his body, starting with his fingers and toes, slowly making my way to larger ones. Then I would puncture his lungs and maybe a few other organs, basically give him as much pain as possible before killing him. This guy would have been great with Torquemada in the Spanish Inquisition, using those torture instruments. That's what they were designed to do. One woman said she went 60% of the way toward killing an ex-boyfriend who threatened to make public their sex video. I actually did this. I invited him over for dinner, and as he was in the kitchen, looking stupid, peeling the carrots to make a salad, I came to him, laughing gently so he wouldn't suspect anything. I thought about grabbing a knife quickly and stabbing him in the chest repeatedly until he was dead. I actually did the first thing, but he saw my intentions and ran away. Now, these are just fantasies. These are mostly college-age kids. But David actually interviewed a lot of people who were in jail for killing somebody and asked them what happened. Why did they do it? So one Australian man named Don was killed by his wife, Sue, after 14 years of his abuse. So here is her account. This is the account of what happened. Don had become abusive verbally and physically. The latter included many types of humiliation and being hit across the head regularly, being threatened with death, being locked in a closet, and being forced to sit looking in a mirror while Don made derogatory comments about her. On the night of the killing, Don held a knife to Sue's throat while threatening to kill her. He had also had both locked her in a closet and urinated in her face. Later that night, after Don had gone to sleep, Sue struck him with an axe to the side of the neck about 3 times. She then stabbed him in the stomach about 6 times with a large carving knife. Now, except for Don, is there anybody who would not be sympathetic to this? I mean, this is a reasoned response, actually, if you think about it. From an evolutionary perspective, if you don't stand up to people like this, you could be killed. So these moral emotions are there for a reason. It's not that people are evil, they have a bad side. If we could just genetically engineer it out or somehow get rid of it, that this would be good. No, you have to have a certain level of this to defend yourself. And then what happens is this, you get carried away. So this, something called a rage or forward panic. What happens is another case of a woman named Susan who stabbed her husband 193 times. And she talked about, I stabbed him in the leg for every time he kicked me. I stabbed him in the arm for every time he hit me. I stabbed him in the penis for every time he made me have sex with him. I stabbed him in the neck and the head. And she just went on and on. It's just like a forward panic, just boom, boom, boom. And so that's the sort of the normal, this is David Buss's argument, you have this normal moral emotions that you got to stand up and fight for yourself, and then it gets carried away if there's, triggering circumstances like that. This is why cops get out of hand when there's like racial tensions in a town like Ferguson or the Rodney King beating. They just get all hyped up and then it just explode in rage, and it's really hard to control that. So in a way, homicide is a form of self-help justice. This idea comes from the sociologist Donald Black's 1983 paper, in which he reported that 90% of homicides, or murders, are moralistic in nature. In other words, only about 10% are instrumental, and I'm even doubtful about those. So he talks about like robbing a bank or burglaring a house. But a bank robber doesn't want to kill tellers. The bank robber just wants the money. And if they have to kill somebody, maybe they do, but they don't want to kill somebody. They just want the money. The burglar who burgles your house, they hope you're not home. They canvass neighborhoods and wait for people to leave. Then if you happen to show up, maybe they kill you. These examples are quite different from that. One was a man who killed his wife after she dared him to during an argument over paying bills. A woman who killed her husband during a quarrel in which the man struck her daughter. A young man killed his brother during a heated discussion about the latter's sexual advances toward his younger sisters. A woman who killed her 21-year-old son because he'd been fooling around with homosexuals and drugs. And others during altercations over the parking of an automobile. You might remember last month we had a triple homicide in North Carolina. 3 Muslim students were killed, gunned down. And so it was first thought to be a hate crime, the rise of Islamophobia because of 9/11 and ISIS and all that. No, it turns out the cops reported that it was they were fighting over a parking spot. I mean, how bad is that? I mean, that's pretty bad. Okay, so part of the problem is having 300 million guns lying around, which is what we have. So you have these impulses that bubble up. You lose your temper. If there's a gun laying around, there's trouble. So to kind of bring things around toward the climax here, what I'm arguing is that ever since the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, what I call Enlightenment humanism, instead of moralizing about evil, bad behavior, wars, and homicides and things like that, we've been using science and reason to try to solve these problems. So it begins with the scientific revolution. People like Copernicus and Kepler, Galileo and Newton basically discovered that the universe is governed by natural laws that we can understand. We can discover them, understand them, write them out in mathematical formulas, make predictions, use what we know to change the world. And ever since then, Enlightenment philosophers like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and others before them, Montesquieu, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and so forth, basically wanted to be the Galileo, the Newton of society, of politics, of economics, and so on. Montesquieu's great work, The Spirit of the Laws, by spirit he means the environment, the geography, the working conditions of the people, the culture, determines what kind of laws that they have. And therefore, the laws should be structured based on certain principles of how best people can live in relative harmony based on the environment that they have, the culture, the temperature, the kinds of farming or hunting or industry that they practice, and so on. Francois Quesnay was the physician to the French king who launched a movement called the French Physiocrats. The French, and so his analogy was the king put him in charge of understanding the economy. How does this thing work? Okay, well, it must work like some natural principle. So his analogy was currency flows through an economy like blood flows through a body, you know, circular flow. You'll even hear economists today talk about the circular flow of currency in an economy. They got this from this guy, a physician, who was talking about William Harvey discovered that blood flows through a body in a circular manner. And this inspired the idea of laissez-faire economics. That's where the term comes from, is from the French physiocrats. Just leave the economy alone. Let people be to trade, and that will have a smooth flowing currency. If there's too much blockage from the king, then that can interfere. So he told the king, you know, just let people, leave them alone, laissez-faire. That inspired, amongst other sources, Adam Smith's great work, the founding book of modern economics, which everybody knows is The Wealth of Nations. That's not the title of the book. There's the title of the book. An inquiry. It's a study, a scientific study of the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. What is wealth? Where does it come from? How does it grow? How does it shrink? What causes these things? It's a scientific work. It's the first work of science to study the economy. Thomas Hobbes, another great Enlightenment thinker, he called himself the Galileo of civil society. He starts off, he writes this massive book, 450 pages. It's about the same length of the Moral Arc. So it's okay to write a longer book if you have. And so his ideas was, let's figure out how best people should live in a civil society. He starts off with atoms, particles in motion. He's an atomist. He thinks of it like, okay, so atoms bump off each other, and then they impinge on our senses. We form simple ideas form complex ideas. He has this whole associationist psychology theory. This is the beginning of associationist psychology, right there with Thomas Hobbes. He builds and builds and builds, and before you know it, he supports the king, the monarchy in England during the Civil War. Okay, that's a different story. Everybody has a political agenda. That's okay. But his idea is it's scientific work. And so let's just take that one case of what the Leviathan can do. And this was his argument, and he's largely right. Turns out he's been largely right. That is, if you have a Leviathan state with a monopoly on legitimate use of force, it decreases incentives for exploitative attack. It reduces the need for deterrence and vengeance. It replaces self-help justice with criminal justice. Instead of people going out in the middle of the night to settle their scores, which causes violence to increase, it causes societies to be less trustworthy, it interferes with commerce and so forth. It's just not good. So if the state takes it out of the people's hands and puts it in the courts, then you have the replacing of the culture of honor with the culture of law. Now the problem is, we know, is that sometimes Leviathan states can turn really bad. Autocracies, theocracies, dictatorships, and things like that. So Rudy Rummel was a political scientist. He just died last year. He was at the University of Hawaii. He wrote an important book called Death by Government. And he was the first to tally up the number of people that have been killed by their own governments. He called it democide. It turns out, according to his tallies anyway, more people have been killed by their own governments than have died in wars, between governments. But then he wrote a second book called Democracy as a Method of Nonviolence. That is, power kills, and here's the solution. Bad power, good power. Or at least not as bad power. Rudy was echoing Immanuel Kant's theory, what's now called the democratic peace theory. Immanuel Kant was the first to speculate in his book Perpetual Peace. Basically, it's a little short book about how governments should be, how governments can become more peaceful or less peaceful. And it was inspired by a sign at a pub next to a cemetery called Perpetual Peace. That's not the kind of perpetual peace, 6 feet under that we want. It was sort of ironic. But it was Kant who first proposed as 3 factors: a republic, a democracy, something like that, where the people are actively involved in the government. Trade or economic interdependency between nations reduces conflict. And then open borders and good relations between countries through mutual organizations, something like that. Kant, by the way, was an Enlightenment scientist, called a philosopher, but I would call him a scientist, who was the first to propose a theory for the origin of the solar system. So again, these guys are thinking like scientists. That's a problem. Where did the solar system come from? Why do countries go to war? They're all in the same category. These are just problems to solve. Right? Anyway, so just fast forward a couple centuries, Bruce Russett and John O'Neill tested the democratic peace theory. Okay, what they're testing is this idea, no two countries that are democracies ever go to war. You hear this, people say this. And then other people go, well, wait a minute. What about Argentina and Great Britain? They went to war. What about the United States and Great Britain? They were two democracies. What about the American Civil War? That was two democracies. What about those Greek states? They were supposed to be democracies. Okay. So the problem is, instead of thinking things black and white, think of them on a continuum. So what they did was they took the correlates of war projects with their 2,300 militarized disputes, interstate disputes, for almost 2 centuries, and then they used the Polity Project, assigning, a scale of 1 to 10, the quality of your government. And what they found was that when both countries are fully democratic, that is, they score 8 or higher on the Polity Project, the conflicts are reduced by 50%. When the less democratic member of a pair lean toward autocracy, wars increase by 100%. Therefore, the formula is as democracies increase, violence or conflicts between them decrease. So Kant was right. It's a testable hypothesis. And here you can see the data, again from the book. This is, the black line records the increase in autocracies, which climbed all the way up to the mid-1970s, and then they started to go out of business. And then democracy sort of stumbled along here through the 60s and 70s, and then really took off in the 80s and early 90s. And at that time, interstate conflicts dramatically declined. So this is the decline of war conflicts, largely in part due to not just democracy, but also trade and membership in intergovernmental organizations is the other factor. So those 3 factors. Here's a low-hanging fruit test case. North Korea and South Korea. One's a democracy, one's a dictatorship or an autocracy. You can see the difference from space, from 23,000 miles up. North Korea, South Korea. You can see the difference in their heights, 10-centimeter difference in height between South Koreans and North Koreans. What has democracy got to do with height? Democracies are more prosperous. They have better economies. South Koreans make almost $20,000 a year. North Koreans make barely more than $1,000 a year. More money buys you better food, amongst other things. Better education, better literacy rates, better democracy, better everything. So the formula is democracies are better than autocracies, then we ought to spread democracies wherever we can, to what extent we can. Why? Because democracies place more emphasis on individual rights and individual liberty than any other form of governance. And thus they promote the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. That's us, by the way. And that gets me to page 1 of my book. This is where I begin. I start with the survival and flourishing of sentient beings as a basis for establishing values and morals. And so determining the conditions by which sentient beings best flourish ought to be the goal of a science of morality. That is to say, the constitutions of human societies ought to be built on the constitution of human nature. And so I will end with the final sentences of the moral arc, concluding with, again, the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who reflected on that dual nature I mentioned, that each of us is 2 selves. The great burden of life is to always try to keep that higher self in command, and every time that lower self acts up and tells us to do wrong, let us allow that higher self to tell us that we were made for the stars, created for the everlasting, born for eternity. Well, Dr. King was a Baptist preacher, and I'm an atheist, so I have a slightly different perspective on this thing. I think, in fact, we are made from the stars. Our atoms were forged in the interiors of ancient stars that entered their lives in spectacular paroxysms of supernova explosions that dispersed those atoms into space, where they coalesced into new solar systems with planets, life, and sentient beings capable of such sublime knowledge and moral wisdom. We are stardust. We are golden. We are billion-year-old carbon. Morality is something that carbon atoms can embody, given 1 billion years of evolution. The moral arc. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. politics is nothing new. It seems worse than ever, and people worry mostly about the right-wing Republican conservatives getting most of the money from billionaires like the Koch brothers.
Or is this? I think, yeah.